The night I gave away everything, people called me a fool. The strange part was that for the first time in my life, I finally felt free. The city glittered beneath me like a field of diamonds scattered across black velvet. From the 49th floor of Sterling Global Headquarters, Manhattan looked immortal. Streams of headlights traced golden rivers between steel towers. Helicopters blinked red against the clouds. Somewhere below, millions of people were chasing dreams they believed would make them happy. 3 years ago, I would have told you I had already won that race. My name is Ethan Sterling. At 38 years old, financial magazines called me a visionary. Business networks called me a titan. Competitors called me dangerous. Depending on the month, my net worth hovered somewhere around $11 billion. I owned penthouses, vacation homes, private aircraft, and enough investments to generate more money in a single day than most families would see in a lifetime. People spent years trying to get into rooms I could enter with a single phone call. Politicians returned my messages. CEOs waited for my approval. Reporters followed my every move. Yet on that particular November evening, none of it felt real. The conference room behind me was filled with the most powerful people in my company. Men and women in tailored suits sat around a 20-foot walnut table beneath lights that cost more than my first car. Some looked confused. Others looked nervous. A few appeared angry. In front of me sat a stack of papers worth more than entire corporations. One signature would transfer operational control of Sterling Global into new hands. One signature would end the career I had spent nearly 2 decades building. The fountain pen felt unusually heavy between my fingers. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow had begun drifting across the skyline. Tiny white flecks danced through the darkness like silent reminders that winter always arrives eventually, no matter how powerful you think you are. Ethan, one board member said carefully, "You still have time to reconsider." I looked at him but didn't answer. Because the truth was simple. They thought I was walking away from a fortune. They didn't understand that the fortune had been walking away from me for years. Success is a strange thing. People imagine it feels like standing at the top of a mountain. What nobody tells you is that eventually you realize there's no higher place to climb. Then all you can hear is the wind. I remembered another night not long before this one. Another set of lights. Another window. Another version of myself standing alone inside a penthouse that overlooked Central Park. 6 bedrooms. 7 bathrooms. Nearly 9,000 square feet. Yet every evening the silence followed me from room to room like a shadow. I would come home after closing billion-dollar deals and pour a glass of expensive bourbon that tasted exactly like every other expensive bourbon. I would stare out at the city and convince myself that happiness was waiting somewhere beyond the next achievement. The next acquisition. The next headline. The next victory. I was wrong. And the woman who taught me that had entered my life when I least expected it. At the time, I didn't know her name would change everything. I didn't know one ordinary conversation would dismantle beliefs I had spent years protecting. Most of all, I didn't know that before this story ended, I would be forced to choose between the empire I built and the only person who ever made me feel human. As I lowered the pen toward the signature line, my reflection stared back from the glass. Older than I remembered. Tired in ways money couldn't fix. The room held its breath. And for a moment, I found myself thinking about Grace Bennett. I used to believe that every person had a price. Some were just better at negotiating than others. 3 years before I sat in that conference room with a pen hovering over my future, I was exactly the man people imagined when they heard the word billionaire. My days started before sunrise and ended long after midnight. Every hour belonged to schedules, acquisitions, meetings, forecasts, and decisions that moved millions of dollars across screens. The city woke up around me, but I rarely noticed. Most mornings I stood in front of the glass wall of my penthouse, coffee growing cold in my hand, while Central Park slowly emerged from the darkness below. The view was spectacular. I had paid $18 million for that view. Yet after a while, even spectacular becomes ordinary. My assistant managed every minute of my calendar. My driver waited downstairs every morning at exactly 6:45. Investors competed for my attention. Journalists described me as disciplined, ruthless, brilliant. The funny thing was that none of them knew me at all. They knew the version of Ethan Sterling that appeared on magazine covers. The version that smiled during interviews and spoke confidently about growth and innovation. They never saw the silence that followed me home every night. They never saw the empty dining table built for 12 people where I almost always ate alone. That Thursday started like every other Thursday. By noon, I had already completed 3 meetings, approved 2 acquisitions, and rejected a merger proposal worth nearly $400 million. The board considered it a productive day. I considered it forgettable. Around 3 in the afternoon, I left headquarters earlier than usual because a sudden winter storm was moving toward Manhattan. Gray clouds rolled across the skyline, swallowing sunlight and turning the city silver. Traffic slowed. Horns echoed through wet streets. My driver suggested taking the direct route home, but I asked him to stop near Riverside Community Arts Center instead. I do not know why. Maybe I wanted fresh air. Maybe I was tired of glass towers and conference rooms. Or maybe life was already moving pieces into place long before I understood the game. Snowflakes drifted through the air as I stepped onto the sidewalk. Across the street stood a small brick building squeezed between a bookstore and a coffee shop. A colorful banner hung above the entrance. Community Winter Art Fair. Children and families moved in and out carrying paintings and handmade decorations. It was not the kind of place people like me usually visited, which was probably why I crossed the street. Warm air greeted me when I walked inside. The scent of coffee, paint, and cinnamon filled the room. Laughter echoed off the walls. Handmade artwork covered folding tables. Nothing was expensive. Nothing was exclusive. Nobody cared who I was. For the first time in years, that felt strangely refreshing. I wandered between displays until I heard a woman speaking nearby. Her voice was calm and warm, carrying easily above the crowd. She was helping a little girl hang a painting that kept slipping sideways. The child giggled. The woman laughed with her and adjusted the frame again. I turned without thinking, and there she was, Grace Bennett. At that moment, she was just a stranger standing beneath a string of white lights. A woman with paint on her sleeve and snow melting in her hair. She smiled at the little girl like nothing else in the world mattered. I had spent years surrounded by people chasing status. Grace looked like someone who had already found something better. I did not know it then, but that simple moment would become the dividing line between the life I thought I wanted and the life I actually needed. I should have walked away after that first glance. That would have been the logical thing to do. Spend 10 minutes at the community center, make a small donation, shake a few hands, and return to the predictable world where everything followed spreadsheets and contracts. Instead, I stayed. I found myself drifting toward the display tables where local artists had arranged paintings and handmade crafts. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Children ran between tables carrying paper snowflakes and cups of hot chocolate. Nobody noticed me. Nobody cared that my photograph had appeared on the cover of a business magazine the month before. For reasons I could not explain, I liked that. Grace was helping visitors throughout the afternoon. Sometimes she adjusted artwork on the walls. Sometimes she answered questions from parents. Sometimes she simply listened. That was what caught my attention most. She listened as if every person mattered. An elderly man spent nearly 10 minutes explaining the story behind a watercolor painting. Most people would have nodded politely and looked for an escape. Grace listened with genuine interest. The old man walked away smiling. I realized I had not seen that kind of sincerity in years. Eventually, I stopped beside a table displaying student artwork. A painting of the Manhattan skyline had been done in bright colors that ignored reality completely. Buildings glowed purple and gold. The Hudson River looked emerald green. I stared at it longer than I expected. It is not supposed to be realistic, a voice said beside me. I turned. Grace stood there holding a clipboard against her chest. Up close, I noticed faint freckles across her nose and a tiny streak of blue paint near her wrist. I was wondering what the artist was trying to say. I replied, "That New York is more interesting when people stop worrying about being accurate." Her smile appeared for half a second. "That sounds expensive." I laughed before I could stop myself. It surprised both of us. Most conversations around me involved negotiations or strategy. This one felt refreshingly normal. We talked about the painting, then another, then a sculpture made from recycled metal. For nearly 15 minutes, she had no idea who I was. When I finally introduced myself, I expected recognition, maybe surprise, perhaps the familiar shift in attitude people often displayed after learning my name. Instead, she simply nodded. "Nice to meet you, Ethan." That was it. No widened eyes. No sudden curiosity about my career. No questions about money. Just a normal greeting. It should not have felt remarkable, yet somehow it did. Before leaving, I stopped by the donation table near the entrance. The community center clearly needed funding. The building was old. The equipment looked outdated. A generous contribution could solve many of those problems immediately. I wrote a check large enough to cover their annual budget and handed it to one of the volunteers. The next morning, I received a phone call. My assistant sounded confused. "Mr. Sterling, the community center returned your donation." I thought she had misspoken. "Returned it?" "Yes, sir." They included a note. A few moments later, the scan message appeared on my screen. It contained one sentence written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for wanting to help, but relationships should begin with honesty, not giant checks." At the bottom sat a signature. Grace Bennett. I stared at those words for a long time. Nobody returned my money. Nobody. Yet instead of feeling offended, I found myself smiling. For the first time in years, I had met someone who seemed completely unimpressed by everything I owned. And somehow that made me want to know her even more. Most people spend their lives trying to impress someone. Grace seemed completely uninterested in that game. The week after she returned my donation, I found myself thinking about her far more often than I should have. During meetings, her handwritten note would appear in my mind. During interviews, I caught myself wondering what she would say about the polished answers I gave reporters. The realization annoyed me. I was supposed to be focused on a multi-billion-dollar expansion project. Instead, I was distracted by a woman who had politely rejected my money. 2 Saturdays later, I returned to the community center. This time there was no event, no crowd, no banners, just a cold afternoon and a building filled with ordinary life. Children painted at folding tables. Volunteers carried supplies through hallways. Someone played soft music from an old speaker near the front desk. Grace was kneeling beside a young boy, helping him mix colors on a paper palette. She looked up when I entered. For a moment, surprise crossed her face. Then amusement. "You know there are easier ways to make a donation," she said. "I am not here to make a donation." She raised an eyebrow. "That sounds suspicious." I laughed. Again, the fact that she could make me laugh so easily was becoming a problem. Over the next hour, she gave me a tour of the center. Every room seemed to hold a story. Art classes, music lessons, after-school programs. None of it generated headlines. None of it attracted investors. Yet people cared deeply about it. Grace knew the names of nearly everyone we passed. More importantly, they knew hers. A teenage girl ran over to show her a sketchbook. An elderly volunteer stopped to ask about his granddaughter. A little boy proudly displayed a ceramic mug he had made. Grace listened to each of them with the same attention she gave everyone else. It fascinated me. In my world, attention was currency. People gave it only when they expected something in return. Grace gave it freely. After the tour, we walked to a small coffee shop down the block. Snow drifted past the windows while customers huddled around steaming mugs. I offered to buy her coffee. She accepted after making me promise not to leave a ridiculous tip. We talked for nearly 2 hours. About books, about travel, about childhood memories, about the strange things people believed would make them happy. She asked surprisingly few questions about my company. Instead, she asked about me. Not my success. Me. I realized how rare that was. At some point, she looked out the window and smiled. "You know what is funny?" she asked. "People spend so much time building impressive lives that they forget to build meaningful ones." The words settled somewhere deep inside me. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend everything I had spent years creating. Instead, I found myself staring into my coffee cup, because part of me feared she might be right. When we finally stood to leave, the sun had disappeared behind the skyline. Streetlights glowed against fresh snow. Grace pulled on her coat and smiled. "See you around, Ethan. See you around." Such simple words. Yet as I watched her walk away down the sidewalk, I realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, I was already looking forward to tomorrow. The changes were small at first, so small that nobody except me noticed them. I started leaving the office before 8 o'clock at night. I stopped scheduling meetings on Sunday mornings. I found myself walking instead of immediately calling for a car. For the first time in years, my calendar had empty spaces in it, and somehow those empty spaces always seemed to lead back to Grace. We met for coffee, then lunch, then long conversations that stretched far beyond what either of us intended. She never treated me like a billionaire. If anything, she seemed mildly annoyed whenever other people did. One evening, we were sitting on a bench overlooking the Hudson River while ferries moved through the dark water below. The city lights shimmered across the surface like scattered gold coins. I was explaining a recent business acquisition that had made financial news. Most people reacted to those stories with admiration. Grace listened quietly before taking a sip of coffee. "Do you actually enjoy it?" she asked. "The deal?" "No. The chase." I stared at the river. Nobody had ever asked me that question. For years I had assumed success and enjoyment were the same thing. Suddenly I was not so sure. I admitted. "And now?" I watched a fairy disappear into the darkness. "I do not know." She nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. The strange thing was that she never tried to change me. She never criticized my career, never lectured me about wealth. She simply asked questions that forced me to think about things I had spent years avoiding. Unfortunately, other people were beginning to notice how much time I spent with her. The first warning came from my mother during a charity gala. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead while donors circulated through the ballroom. She approached me with a practiced smile and a glass of sparkling water. "I hear you have been spending time with someone." The tone alone told me this was not casual curiosity. "Her name is Grace." My mother glanced around the room. "What does she do?" "She runs programs at a community arts center." A brief silence followed. "That is admirable," she said carefully. The way she said admirable made it sound like a problem. A week later, one of my board members invited me to lunch. Halfway through the meal, the conversation shifted from market forecasts to my personal life. Then another executive made a similar comment. Then an investor. Then a longtime family friend. Different words. Same message. They viewed Grace as an unexpected complication. Someone outside the carefully constructed world they understood. Someone who did not fit. At first I dismissed their concerns. Yet the comments continued. The more serious my relationship with Grace became, the more uncomfortable certain people appeared. One rainy evening, after another exhausting round of subtle criticism, I found myself standing outside the community center. Warm light spilled through the windows. Inside, children laughed while Grace helped them decorate a wall for an upcoming event. She looked happy, completely, effortlessly happy. As I watched her through the glass, a realization settled over me. The people questioning her value had never even met her. They only saw what she lacked. They never bothered to see what she gave. And for the first time in my life, I found myself caring far more about one woman's opinion than the approval of everyone else combined. The mistake that changed everything started with good intentions. Looking back, that made it worse. Spring arrived in Manhattan with cold rain and stubborn gray skies. Grace and I had been seeing each other for months. By then she knew my habits. She knew I drank coffee that went cold because I forgot it existed. She knew I answered emails too late at night. She knew I pretended work did not stress me even when it obviously did. And somehow she cared anyway. One Tuesday afternoon she called while I was between meetings. Her voice sounded tired. Not upset, just tired. The community center's roof had started leaking after a storm. Several classrooms needed repairs. Funding was tight. Volunteers were doing everything they could. She mentioned it casually, the same way someone might mention bad weather. She was not asking for help. That was the problem. In my world, problems existed to be solved. If a company needed resources, I provided resources. If a project needed funding, I provided funding. Results followed. Simple, efficient, familiar. So without telling Grace, I made a few phone calls. By the end of the week, a construction firm had inspected the building. A private foundation connected to my company approved a substantial grant. New equipment was ordered. Repairs were scheduled. From my perspective, it was a success. People would benefit. Children would have a better place to learn. Everybody won. At least that was what I believed until I arrived at the community center that Friday evening. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The hallways were quiet. Grace stood alone in one of the classrooms, staring at a stack of paperwork on a table. The moment I saw her face, I knew something was wrong. Disappointment is quieter than anger. That is what makes it harder to face. She held up one of the grant documents. "You did this." I nodded. The center needed help. Silence filled the room. "You should have talked to me." I was trying to make things easier. "For who?" The question caught me off guard. "For everyone." She looked away. "That is exactly the problem, Ethan." The rain outside seemed louder. I felt something tightening in my chest. "I do not understand." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You never asked what we needed. You decided. You stepped in and fixed everything before anyone else had a chance to speak." I opened my mouth to defend myself, then stopped. because a terrible realization was beginning to form. She was right. I had not listened. I had acted the same way I always acted in business. Identify a problem, apply resources, control the outcome. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that relationships were not companies. People were not projects. Grace folded the paperwork and set it down. Her eyes glistened with hurt that I had never intended to cause. "You keep saying you see me," she whispered. "But sometimes I think all you see is something that needs your help." The words landed harder than any criticism I had ever received. Because for the first time, I could not argue. I stood there searching for the right thing to say while she picked up her coat. Then she walked toward the door. And for the first time since meeting Grace Bennett, I had absolutely no idea how to stop someone from leaving. People assume heartbreak arrives with dramatic arguments and slammed doors. Sometimes it arrives in silence. The week after Grace walked away from that classroom felt longer than entire years of my life. I told myself she needed space. I told myself she would call when she was ready. I told myself 100 different things because the truth was harder to accept. I had disappointed the one person whose opinion mattered more than I wanted to admit. For the first few days, I buried myself in work. That had always been my solution. When life became complicated, I made it smaller by focusing on numbers. Numbers behaved. Numbers followed rules. Emotions did not. I sat through meetings, signed contracts, approved budgets. People congratulated me on a record quarter. Sterling Global stock reached another all-time high. Financial analysts praised my leadership. Yet every achievement felt strangely distant. Like I was watching someone else's life through thick glass. One evening I returned to my penthouse after a 14-hour day. Rain streaked across the windows overlooking Central Park. The city glowed beneath low clouds. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. It should have felt impressive. Instead, it felt empty. I loosened my tie and walked through the apartment. The silence followed me from room to room. The dining table remained untouched. The kitchen looked exactly as it had that morning. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. For years I had called that peace. Now it felt like loneliness. My phone buzzed. For a brief second, hope surged through me. Then I saw the screen. Another business message. Another request. Another opportunity worth millions. I set the phone down without answering. That was when I realized something frightening. Every success in my life suddenly felt smaller because Grace was not there to share it. A few days later, I drove past the community center. I told myself it was accidental. It was not. Children were entering through the front doors carrying art supplies and backpacks. Volunteers moved equipment inside. Life continued exactly as it always had. Grace stood near the entrance speaking with a parent. Even from across the street, I could see the warmth in her smile. She looked happy. The sight should have comforted me. Instead, it hurt. Because for the first time I understood something I had never considered before. Grace had a complete life before she met me. A meaningful life. A life built on relationships and purpose and people who genuinely cared about her. If I disappeared tomorrow, she would keep moving forward. The harder truth was realizing I could no longer say the same about myself. That night, I sat alone in my office long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights reflected off the glass walls. My reflection stared back at me. Expensive suit. Corner office. Billion-dollar view. Everything I had spent years building surrounded me. Yet all I could think about was a simple coffee shop, a community center, and a woman who once told me that meaningful lives mattered more than impressive ones. Somewhere along the way, she had become the center of every future I imagined. And standing there alone, I finally admitted the truth. I was not afraid of losing my reputation. I was not afraid of losing my fortune. I was terrified that I had already lost Grace. The next morning, I did something that would have sounded ridiculous to the man I used to be. I cleared my schedule. My assistant nearly dropped her tablet when I told her to cancel 3 meetings, postpone a conference call, and move a dinner with investors. The world did not end. The stock market did not collapse. Sterling Global continued operating exactly as it always had. Apparently, I was not as indispensable as I had spent years believing. That realization was humbling. For weeks, I stopped trying to solve the situation with strategy. I stopped looking for shortcuts. I stopped searching for the perfect speech that would magically fix everything. Instead, I started showing up. Not at Grace's apartment. Not outside her workplace. I respected her space. But I began spending time in the parts of the city she had introduced me to. The bookstore where she bought used novels. The coffee shop where she knew the barista by name. The small public park where families gathered on Saturday mornings. Places I would never have noticed before meeting her. The city looked different now. Slower. More human. One afternoon I volunteered at a neighborhood cleanup event organized by the community center. Nobody had invited me personally. I simply signed up online like everyone else. For 3 hours I filled trash bags, carried supplies, and listened to conversations that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market projections. Nobody cared about my title. Most people did not even recognize me. Strangely, that felt liberating. A week later, I helped repaint a classroom at a local youth center. The smell of fresh paint lingered on my clothes for hours afterward. I remembered how Grace always seemed comfortable in places like this. Comfortable contributing without expecting recognition. I was beginning to understand why. There was a quiet satisfaction in helping simply because something needed to be done, not because it generated profit, not because it improved an image, just because it mattered. Then one rainy Thursday evening, I finally saw her again. I was leaving a small grocery store carrying 2 paper bags when I spotted her across the street. Grace stood beneath a red umbrella waiting for the crosswalk signal. My heart reacted before my brain did. For a moment, I considered walking away. Maybe she still needed distance. Maybe she did not want to see me. Then she looked up. Our eyes met through the rain. Neither of us moved. Traffic rolled between us. Headlights reflected across wet pavement. The city seemed to fade into the background. Grace looked surprised, then cautious. I could not blame her. I crossed the street slowly and stopped several feet away. Close enough to talk. Far enough to respect her boundaries. Rain tapped softly against her umbrella. Hi, I said. It was the simplest word in the English language. Somehow it felt harder than any boardroom presentation I had ever delivered. Grace studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded. Hi, Ethan. There was no anger in her voice. No warmth either. Just uncertainty. The kind that exists when trust has been damaged but not completely destroyed. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then she noticed the paint stains on my jacket sleeve. Her eyes narrowed slightly. What happened to you? I looked down at the blue and white streaks. A small smile touched the corner of my mouth. I have been learning that not every problem can be solved with a check. For the first time in weeks, I saw something soften in her expression. For a while, things felt fragile but hopeful. Grace and I were not back where we had been, but we were talking again. Sometimes that is how trust returns. Not in one dramatic moment. In small conversations. In quiet afternoons. In choices repeated over and over. We met for coffee a few times. Walked through the city without rushing anywhere. The distance between us slowly began to shrink. I told myself to be patient. I told myself that earning trust was supposed to take time. Then everything changed because of a newspaper article. It happened on a Monday morning. I was halfway through a meeting when my phone started vibrating repeatedly. Messages, emails, questions from public relations staff. Something had surfaced online. By lunchtime, the story was everywhere. A business journalist had published an investigation into several major acquisitions Sterling Global completed nearly a decade earlier. Most of the article focused on economic impact and corporate strategy. To the public, it was another business story. To Grace, it was something far more personal. I did not realize that until she called me that evening. Her voice was different. Quiet. Controlled. The kind of control people use when they are trying very hard not to fall apart. Did you know? She asked. I was standing alone in my office, overlooking the city. Know what? Several seconds passed. The redevelopment project on West 42nd Street. My stomach tightened. I remembered it immediately. One of dozens of major projects completed years earlier. Yes. Another silence. Longer this time. Then she spoke. My father lost his bookstore because of that project. The words hit me like ice water. I closed my eyes. Memories surfaced. Meetings. Reports. Expansion plans. Numbers on presentation slides. Back then, it had all felt distant. Abstract. Growth. Opportunity. Progress. I had never met the families affected. Never walked through their neighborhoods. Never understood what those decisions looked like from the other side. Grace, do not. Her voice cracked slightly. Please do not explain it away. I sank into my chair. For the first time in years, I wished I could go back and undo something. I'm not trying to explain it away. Did you know businesses closed? Yes. Did you know people lost homes? My throat felt dry. Yes. The truth sounded terrible spoken aloud. Because it was. Grace took a slow breath. My father spent 23 years building that bookstore. I stared out at the skyline. Somewhere beyond those towers sat countless stories I had never bothered to learn. I did not know it was your family's business, I said quietly. That does not change what happened. No, it did not. That was the problem. For years I had measured success through numbers, revenue, growth, market share. Nobody ever placed a photograph of a struggling family next to a quarterly report. Nobody included heartbreak in financial projections. Yet suddenly that was all I could see. Grace's father, his bookstore, a life disrupted by decisions made in conference rooms like the ones I had spent years controlling. Why did you never tell me? I asked. She laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because I never imagined the man I cared about would be connected to the reason my family lost everything. The city lights blurred beyond the glass. And as the silence settled between us, I realized the hardest part was not that Grace had discovered the truth. The hardest part was knowing she had every reason to question whether the man she loved had ever truly changed at all. For the next several days, I barely slept. Every conversation with Grace replayed in my head. Every decision from my past felt heavier than it had when I first made it. I dug through old reports, acquisition records, redevelopment plans, and meeting notes from nearly a decade earlier. Thousands of pages sat on my desk. Numbers, charts, forecasts, predictions, the language of business. Somewhere inside those documents was the story of a bookstore that had once belonged to Grace's father. A bookstore I had never seen. A family I had never met. A consequence I had never understood. The more I read, the worse I felt. Not because anyone had broken laws. Not because there had been corruption. The truth was more uncomfortable. Everything had been perfectly legal, perfectly efficient, perfectly profitable. That was the problem. Entire lives had been reduced to percentages on spreadsheets. A week later, the board called an emergency meeting. The investigation article continued attracting attention. Investors wanted reassurance. Directors wanted stability. Public relations teams wanted control of the narrative. I sat at the head of the conference table while executives discussed damage management strategies. One suggestion after another filled the room. Press statements, interviews, reputation campaigns. Nobody mentioned the people affected. Finally, I interrupted. How many businesses closed because of the redevelopment project? Silence followed. Several executives exchanged glances. One director adjusted his glasses. The project increased long-term shareholder value significantly, he answered. That is not what I asked. More silence. I realized they genuinely did not understand why I cared. A year earlier, I would not have understood either. After the meeting, the chairman requested a private conversation. We stood near the windows overlooking Manhattan. Clouds drifted between skyscrapers. The city looked distant beneath the afternoon haze. You have changed, he said carefully. Maybe. Investors are concerned. I laughed softly. Investors are always concerned. He did not smile. This situation with Grace Bennett is becoming a distraction. Hearing her name in that room immediately irritated me. She is not a distraction. From a business perspective, she is influencing decisions. I stared at him. Maybe she is helping me make better ones. His expression hardened slightly. Your responsibility is to the company. There it was. The sentence I had heard in different forms my entire adult life. Duty, obligation, growth, profit, shareholders. For years those words had guided every major decision I made. Yet standing there, I found myself asking a question I had never considered before. Responsibility to what? A stock price? A quarterly report? A title printed on an office door? That evening I walked through the city alone. No driver. No assistants. No schedule. Summer air drifted between buildings. Restaurants buzzed with conversation. Families filled sidewalks. Street musicians performed for strangers who paused long enough to listen. Ordinary life unfolded all around me. Life that existed completely outside boardrooms and earnings reports. My phone vibrated. A message from Grace. The first one in days. My heart immediately accelerated. I opened it. The text was short. We need to talk. Most people would have seen 4 simple words. I saw a crossroads. Because deep down, I already knew what was coming. The question was whether I was finally willing to pay the price that real change demanded. Grace chose a small park overlooking the river. The sun was setting when I arrived. Orange lights stretched across the water while people walked along the path carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. Ordinary lives moving forward. Grace sat on a bench beneath a maple tree. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city hummed softly in the distance. A ferry drifted across the river. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. The world felt strangely peaceful considering how much was about to change. Grace looked tired. Not angry. Not cold. Just exhausted by questions neither of us seemed able to answer. "I spent days thinking about what happened," she said quietly. I nodded. "So did I." She stared at the water. "I believe you care about me." The words should have made me happy. Instead, they hurt. Because I knew what was coming next. But, she smiled sadly. But caring about someone and building a life with them are not always the same thing. I looked down at my hands. For years, I had negotiated billion-dollar agreements without feeling nervous. At that moment, I could barely breathe. Grace turned toward me. "Your world keeps asking you to choose, Ethan." "I know. And every time it does, people get hurt." The truth of that settled heavily between us. My company wanted loyalty. Investors wanted stability. Directors wanted certainty. Everyone wanted something. The only difference was that Grace never had. She had never asked me to become someone else. She had only asked me to be honest about who I already was. "I cannot spend the rest of my life wondering whether business will always come first," she whispered. The sentence landed harder than anything else she had said. Because once again, I could not argue. There had been a time when business always came first. A very long time. Long enough to shape every part of my identity. Long enough that I no longer knew where Ethan Sterling ended and Sterling Global began. We sat in silence while evening settled around us. Then Grace reached into her bag and handed me a folded newspaper clipping. I recognized it immediately. The redevelopment article. The story that had exposed everything. "My father kept this," she said. "Why?" "Because he wanted to remember what happened." I unfolded the paper slowly. Then I noticed something written on the back in faded ink. A sentence. Just one. "Do not let bitterness become your future." I stared at the handwriting. "Your father wrote this?" Grace nodded. The bookstore broke his heart, but he refused to spend the rest of his life angry. The river reflected the last light of sunset. Somewhere deep inside me, something finally became clear. For months, I had been trying to save my relationship with Grace. I had been trying to prove I had changed. I had been trying to balance two worlds that no longer fit together. Suddenly, I understood the real problem. I was still holding on to a version of myself that no longer existed. The next morning, I walked into Sterling Global headquarters before sunrise. The building was quiet. Empty. The city outside was still waking up. I entered the boardroom carrying a single folder. Inside sat my resignation letter. By noon, every member of the board would know my decision. By the end of the day, the life I had spent nearly 20 years building would belong to someone else. And for the first time since I founded the company, I felt absolutely certain about what I was doing. The headlines lasted for weeks. Financial networks debated my decision. Analysts called it reckless. Commentators called it emotional. Some people assumed there had been a hidden strategy. Others insisted I would return within months. The truth was much simpler. For the first time in my adult life, I stopped building my schedule around an empire. The morning after my resignation became official, I woke up without a calendar full of meetings waiting for me. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor of my penthouse. For several minutes, I simply stood by the window holding a cup of coffee and watching the city wake up. No conference calls. No earnings reports. No investors demanding answers. The silence felt unfamiliar. Then something unexpected happened. It also felt peaceful. Over the following months, my life became smaller in ways that surprised me. I sold properties I never used. I stepped away from private memberships and exclusive events. I moved into a much more modest apartment on the Upper West Side. By most standards, it was still beautiful. By my old standards, it was practically invisible. And that was exactly what I wanted. I began volunteering regularly at organizations throughout the city. Not because anyone asked me to. Not because cameras were watching. Simply because I had finally learned that contribution and recognition were not the same thing. Some mornings I helped serve breakfast at a community center. Other afternoons, I worked alongside volunteers repairing classrooms and organizing educational programs. Nobody treated me like a celebrity. Most people cared far more about whether I showed up consistently than what my last name happened to be. They were right. Character is built through repetition, not reputation. Every now and then I would see an article about Sterling Global. The company continued growing. New leadership took over. Investors adapted. The world kept turning. That realization changed something inside me. For years I had believed everything depended on me. It did not. What mattered was what I chose to do with the time I had been given. Grace remained distant during much of that year. We spoke occasionally, sometimes over coffee, sometimes during community events. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no grand declaration. Trust rebuilt itself the same way it had originally been broken. One choice at a time, one conversation at a time, one honest moment at a time. She watched quietly as my life changed. Not for a week, not for a month, for an entire year. She saw me continue showing up even when nobody was applauding. She saw me make decisions that no longer benefited me financially. Most importantly, she saw that I was not becoming a different person to impress her. I was becoming the person I should have been all along. One crisp autumn evening, I walked home through Central Park as golden leaves drifted across the path ahead of me. The air smelled like wood smoke and fallen leaves. Families pushed strollers. Friends laughed over takeout coffee. Ordinary moments surrounded me, the kind I used to overlook completely. As I crossed the street toward my apartment building, my phone buzzed. A message from Grace appeared on the screen. It contained only one sentence. "Can we have dinner tomorrow?" I stopped walking, read it again, then smiled. Because for the first time in a very long time, the future no longer felt like something I needed to control. It felt like something I was finally ready to earn. The restaurant Grace chose was small enough that nobody recognized me and quiet enough that we could hear the rain tapping softly against the windows. A year earlier, I would have reserved an entire dining room at one of the most exclusive places in Manhattan. That night, none of that mattered. Grace sat across from me beneath warm lights, and for the first time in a long time, neither of us seemed to be carrying the weight of the past quite so heavily. We talked for hours, not about boardrooms, not about scandals, not about mistakes. We talked about books she had been reading, about a new arts program at the community center, about a family who had recently moved into the neighborhood and the children she was helping adjust to their new school. Ordinary conversations, the kind that once would have felt insignificant to me. Now they felt priceless. When dinner ended, neither of us seemed eager to leave. We walked through the city together as rain drifted into a light mist. Storefronts reflected across wet sidewalks. Yellow taxi lights blurred into streaks of gold. The city looked softer than I remembered. At one point, Grace stopped beside a bookstore. The display window was filled with novels and handwritten staff recommendations. She smiled. "My father would have loved this place." I smiled too. I think I would have liked meeting him. She looked at me for a moment before slipping her hand into mine. Such a small gesture, yet it meant more than every award, headline, and business victory I had ever collected. Months passed, then more months. Life continued moving forward. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just honestly. Grace and I built something stronger than what we had before because it was no longer based on assumptions. It was built on choices, real ones, the kind people make every day. We spent weekends helping at community events. We traveled occasionally. We argued sometimes and laughed often. Most importantly, we learned how to move through life as partners rather than trying to change one another. One spring afternoon, nearly 3 years after I first walked into that community arts center, a group of children unveiled a mural they had spent months creating. Families gathered around the courtyard. Music played softly through outdoor speakers. Grace stood beside me as the children proudly explained every section of the artwork. Near the center of the mural, painted in bright colors, was a simple message. "What matters is who you become." I stared at those words for a long time, because they captured everything I had spent years learning. Later that evening, as the celebration ended and the last rays of sunlight faded beyond the skyline, Grace leaned against my shoulder. The city stretched before us, familiar and completely different at the same time. I thought about the man I used to be, the one who measured life through ownership and achievement, the one who believed success could fill every empty space. Then I looked at the woman beside me and the life we had built together. The truth finally felt simple. I had not lost an empire. I had escaped one. And in doing so, I found something infinitely more valuable. Not wealth, not status, not power. A purpose worth sharing and a love worth earning. In the end, that was the fortune that changed everything.